Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marion McKean. Welcome to the latest in our Innovation Nation series. This evening's theme is on heritage in recognition of Scotland's Year of History, Heritage and Archaeology. Innovation Nation is an EICC initiative to demonstrate our own commitment to innovation and our venue's position at the forefront of global events technology. Having hosted thousands of conferences and welcomed well over 1 million delegates from all around the world, we are very much in the business of creating an environment which inspires ideas that change the world. Our previous Innovation Nation events have been based on the themes of architecture, medicine, sustainability, and the arts, as well as many other interesting subjects. We have welcomed a diverse range of excellent speakers who have fascinated our audiences with their specialist knowledge and insights into the innovation behind their respective topics. I hope you will enjoy the evening, and I would now like to introduce you to this evening's facilitator, Sue Crossman from the Edinburgh Tourism Action Group. Well.
Good evening, everybody, and let me add my welcome to you all to this very interesting Innovation Nation Heritage Lecture, which I'm much looking forward to, and thank you all for coming. This is the first in a series of lectures celebrating innovation this year, and they've all been themed around history and heritage to help celebrate the themed year. So in a city like Edinburgh, that gives us plenty of opportunities of things to celebrate. Today we're focusing in particular on innovation in heritage, and it was deliberately chosen that because today is World Heritage Day. It's being celebrated all around the world. Today's headline in one of my regular publications that I keep up with, which is the Hindustan Times. The Hindustan Times is exploring Bollywood's connection with the Delhi monuments, which, like Edinburgh, have the all-important and very significant UNESCO World Heritage Site designation. Scotland has 6 World Heritage Sites. I'm sure you know them all. Of course, locally, we've got the Forth Bridge and, closer still, Edinburgh's old and new towns. And look forward to hearing a lot more from the speakers about those. Today is World Heritage Day, and in the best tradition of these things, it has its own hashtag. So if you'd like to tweet live, please do, using the hashtag World Heritage Day. So it'd be great to see Edinburgh getting some coverage on that. So tonight we welcome 2 expert speakers, Adam Wilkinson of Edinburgh World Heritage, and Janet Egdell, who is Operations Director at Registers of Scotland. There's going to be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the speakers' presentations, so I'd ask you to bide your time for that, and we'll use a roving mic at that point, so wait for that. So first, to Adam Wilkinson. Adam is an acknowledged expert in the sustainable management of historic cities. In Edinburgh, he has championed the integrated approach to heritage management through the work of the EWH team in conservation, learning, and advocacy. Internationally, he works with a range of colleagues from other cities to promote and share experience in relation to UNESCO's historic urban landscape approach. He's on the Council of Europa Nostra. He's on the editorial board of the Built Heritage Journal, which is based in Tongji University in China, and has non-exec roles with a number of UK-based heritage organisations. In his free time, he attempts to fit in some family life around and into the restoration of an 18th century manse in a deprived Scottish coal mining settlement. With 2017 marking the 250th anniversary of Edinburgh's new town, Adam will discuss Edinburgh's unique place on the World Heritage stage, and we'll also talk about the events being held to celebrate the anniversary. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Adam Wilkinson.
Well, Thank you, Sue, and thank you, EICC, for such a lovely, warm welcome. I want you to think about heritage slightly differently tonight, not as a fusty old man in a tweed jacket, which is frequently me, but actually as a nice, comfortable pair of spectacles that you put on and view the world through. And that way you can change how you see things. I wonder if I could actually go back to that first slide we had up there, that header slide, because within that you could see innovation all over the place. At the center, we have the monument to one of our leading philosophers, David Hume, whose thoughts, innovation, drove a change in how we view the world. Dugald Stewart in the foreground. We have 4 or 5 architectural innovations there. So heritage and history are a summary of innovation over the ages. It's change which you note when you look back at history, and that change is driven by innovation. Go back to my presentation, that would be great. So I want to talk a little bit about the innovations which drove the creation of the new town, and then the innovations which drove the rescue of the new town, as it's really built into our fabric here. So town planning doesn't always seem like the most wonderful subject to consider when looking at innovation, but it's been a constant source of change. Town planning actually governs how we live our lives. It governs the spaces between our houses. It governs how our houses are built. And here's a fairly early example from about 762. This was built by the Caliph al-Mansur. It is Baghdad. Not as you would recognize it, but with the palace at the center, the roads leading out to Basra, Khorasan, Damascus, and Kufa. Beautiful gardens all around that with temples and other such things within them in that Islamic mode. And then around the edge of that where everybody else lived, building out from the administration further out. Now, that was a fairly early and not terribly successful innovation. Nobody really copied that. But we can go back further and forwards at the same time in that glorious European way. Anybody who can identify this will get a free pint from me later, but what it is essentially is a Roman town with the medieval built on top of it. That's the normal mode of operation for most European cities. You have the Cardo Maximus going from east to west, the road there, and you have the Decumanus going north to south on the left-hand side, and you have the 1960s innovation of the inner ring road, looping around from the top left to the bottom right, cutting off the town centre from the rest of the city. Just reinstating those roads back across with good pedestrian crossings can relink a city centre to its suburbs. Edinburgh only suffered this on the form of Leith Street, and that itself will be undone in the not-too-distant future. But the medieval step was to then introduce a market. So you can see roughly on the left-hand side of that left and right, a widening of the street. That's the market space. And property there was expensive and regulated, highly regulated. So that started to drive, the economics started to drive how towns were planned, but that Roman pattern remained as development happened within it. In Edinburgh, things were slightly different. We didn't have Romans here. So instead we developed the market as a big fat cigar at the center. But to think about why innovation didn't happen, you need to step into the medieval mind for a minute. On the left-hand side, you have the castle. This was the king's. In the center, you have the church. This was God. The king was also God. He was there by divine right. He owned you, he owned your mind. If you stepped out of orthodoxy in your thought, if you thought that the earth went around the sun, you would be taken out and hanged or burned. Thought and innovation were not allowed, they were stifled. And so Edinburgh was dominated by these two powers for a very long time. And then in the 17th century, everything starts to change. That first acceptance that, in fact, it was the other way around and the earth goes around the sun, starts to free up the minds of men. They start to think differently. And by the end of the 17th century, you have a very, very different world in Western Europe of thought, where thought is freer than it was before, and changes start to happen. So in 1755, we had, this will work, in big earthquake in Lisbon. What has this got to do with Edinburgh, you may ask? Well, it has quite a bit. Not least was that Robert Adam, being ever enterprising and trying to get business, put forward a plan for rebuilding. But there, the medieval warren of streets was cleared after the earthquake, and a new town was built within the city, on top of the old. There's nothing particularly knew about new towns as an idea at this point, but here it was done with complete vigour around about 1755 by the Marquis de Pombal. He was an aristocrat leading the change. This was an area of enlightened despotism, not quite like the Enlightenment up in Scotland, and imposed a structure upon the town and upon society as well, with different uses in different parts of the city and the land redistributed accordingly along a very careful and orderly manner. It's a very orderly structure, as you can see, with city blocks. And you can see off to the right-hand side a bit which was not affected, where that old pattern was and is. So the idea of a new town by the 1767 competition for Edinburgh is nothing particularly new. So where's the innovation here? Well, there's no palaces. Across medieval cities, palaces and churches were everywhere. The key spaces are reserved for a church at each end and Register House, that most important of institutions that they built a bridge across to. They didn't build it across the mound, they built the bridge there to link the old town to the key place where the records of the land-based aristocracy or land ownership were retained. This was planned in 1767, not built out until 1800. So the innovation, one might argue, isn't actually at this stage, although James Craig's plan, bringing together everything in orderly blocks and away from the tall tenements of the old town, was certainly a major step. The innovation comes in that they built more of it. This is it Kirkwood? Yes, it is, 1819. And you can start to see the new town building out. Building out, down to the north, down the hill gradually. And it builds out even further. This is 1836. So from the completion of the first new town in 1800 to 1836, you've got a mass of new building and carrying out the new town to an extraordinary scale, a scale not seen anywhere else in Europe, and this carried through until 1900. There's one or two quirks in this plan. India Street meets up neatly with the bottom of the crescent, whereas in fact there's a 30-foot drop. But by and large, the town was built out, as you see in black, and on the right-hand side you have Playfair's scheme for the eastern new town, which was not built out thoroughly. So the scale of ambition is what I think was the most innovative thing about the new town and the way they built out in terms of the big plan. But then we go down to the minor details, and innovation comes through more thoroughly. These are houses in Spitalfields in London, and the new town was to be built with houses in an English style, that is to say, houses which were with this kind of proportion in the classical manner, with classical proportion in a nice terrace. The terraced house is that English gift to the world that you can find pretty much anywhere, be it Australia or America, where there are row houses, or India or Burma. But being Edinburgh and being Scotland, we changed this. We did different things to it. We turned it into a country house. This is the palace front. This is Charlotte Square, the north side, where the architect Robert Adam played with what could have been a boring row of houses and developed it into something really quite special, as grand as the grandest country houses of that time, but all with separate front doors for those houses. This was further developed by other architects as corner blocks then became apartments, going back to that Edinburgh way of living in the tenement. And these is the essence of innovation, is taking an idea and putting it laterally across. We're going to skip forward to the 1970s, by which time the new town was underappreciated, rather late 1960s, and starting to fall into deep disrepair. This is Fettes Row. You can see a huge amount of stone decay on the buildings there as it started to decay and decay and decay. The problem was recognised principally by Sir Robert Matthew, who's on the left-hand side here, a modernist architect who understood the value of the Georgian architecture in terms of its ambition and scale, the architectural and historical values. And then, around about 1972, my predecessor Desmond Hodges was appointed director of the Newtown Conservation Committee. And what the Newtown Conservation Committee did was, and remains, pretty radical. It introduced the notion of supporting the community in the regeneration of a place, not going in there and doing the works itself, as happens in so many major regeneration projects, but supporting people in doing their own works to their properties. And that's work which has led to probably the largest community-led conservation-based regeneration scheme in Europe, which runs through to this day, including the Old Town as well nowadays. This innovative approach finds its high point, I think, in a piece of work we did a couple of years ago with the residents at Well Court, bringing 50-plus owners together to agree on the restoration of a building is no mean feat. But when the community are leading the work and you're not imposing it, it starts to happen. So this involved 2 years of negotiation for a project that cost about £2 million, and the works took about 18 months to carry through. This is a fine building. It's by Sidney Mitchell from the 1890s, built for the workers of the Scotsman. The kinds of works involved were the reconstruction of every single chimney, as they were in danger of falling into the building due to very poor quality past repairs. The repair of nearly all the windows, replacement of all of the roof tiles, because they were about 50 years past their usual lifespan, and high-level stonework where poor past repair and exposure to the elements had accelerated decay. These kinds of works go on. Scaffolding has just gone up on the Cannon Gate for another project with the residents there. So the reasons that people have conserved in the past have been because of those architectural and historical values. Looking to now and what the innovations look like in heritage, we go back to asking, why do we conserve old buildings? If you ask somebody what's important about Edinburgh, they will likely give you a date and a few names. But actually, the reason why Edinburgh is important to them is most usually because it's their home. It's where they live. Why is their house important to them? It meets those basic needs of the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs there, of warmth, rest, security, safety. It allows the belongingness and love and needs. And also, it does, of course, lead to the self-actualization there and those warm, fuzzy feelings as well. But some very hard and definite reasons that people value places beyond just the heritage lens through which we can look at the world. To take that thought a step further, this is a diagram that I drew with a pen and piece of paper as a result of a thought lent me by Anne Power down in London. This is a diagram of a street. If each of those dots is a front door on a street in a city, in a terraced city, let's say, each of those lines represents the web of connections across that street, the social structure and the social network. That social network ends to the creation of a range of memories over time. Those memories become the identity of that place through its people, and that becomes its heritage. So this is not heritage in bricks and mortar. This is heritage of a series of memories and values. And I think that's what should be driving conservation and preservation in the UK and wider at the moment. And that's how we try and prioritize our conservation in the UK, in Edinburgh. If you were to knock down one side of that street, you destroy the social structure and the memories as well as the physical fabric. The two are completely interlinked. And so conservation, we think, needs to support community at its core, rather than just the beautiful architectural and historical values which we traditionally forced into by the Morrison-Ruskin way of thinking. What does that mean on the ground? Well, it means using heritage to do other things beyond just conserving. So this is a program called the Heritage Detectives, which we ran with colleagues at Circle Scotland. And it took kids from a range of backgrounds, and they had to come to our office 1 day a week in the morning to learn about a building and then go and visit that building. Each of these children had been excluded from school or had problems with attending school. And the idea was to give them an idea of who they were and where they were from and see how that would play out. And at the end of their time with us, their 7 weeks, the attendance was perfect. They all attended. We had only one behavioural incident, which was quickly glossed over, as the kids were treated as normal kids when they were at the sites. They had to produce a play about Bondi Brenda, the world's worst tour guide. And they, as the heritage detectives, had been busting her myths. Everyone had some role in that play, whether it was in the lighting or the makeup or in acting in one or two of the kids. And this is performed in Parliament, in front of our parliamentarians here in Edinburgh. That's an enormous step for somebody who can't turn up to school or doesn't want to. The feedback we got from the social workers was that using heritage in this way had improved attendance at school and made a real difference to the lives of some of these kids. One of them came to us and asked us for help in how to get to a job interview afterwards, if he could borrow a suit, how to get on a bus, how to get somewhere in time, basic life skills that are often missed. So you can use heritage in different ways, or more perhaps familiarly here underneath the Regent Bridge, Archibald Elliott's fantastic 1817 structure, one of those Edinburgh bridges that you don't realise is there until you're over it almost, over the valley, the Colton Valley. And here, working with Ingleby Gallery and the Art Festival, we were able to change the lighting ever so slightly with Callum Innes, the wonderful artist who creates thick washes of paint. He did thick washes of light that slowly change over time. This is the back entrance to Waverley Station. Crime dropped to zero. As soon as the lights broke, crime came back again. But by using heritage and highlighting it in this way, working with art and artists, we were able to address crime. We also use it, perhaps more familiarly to people, for addressing energy efficiency as well. Our biggest CO2 emissions come from our housing stock. How can we start to address that? And cities in particular are desperately unsustainable places. How can we start to address that and change that? So on the left-hand side, we have a small project working with children from Abbey Hill Primary on an empty space in the Old Town. They designed a garden for it. The plant varietals were chosen for us by our friends down at the Botanical Gardens. These are all 18th century edible varieties appropriate to that particular space. Design was by the kids, and then the planting and management was by a community group that came together to help relearn gardening and growing skills and teach those to the kids as well. That project continues. It's now in its 4th year. The garden's in great condition. Community are engaged with that space, which was previously closed off. And the continuing teaching of gardening skills goes on. On the right-hand side, we have an image of a typical Georgian building in the new town with some of the measures which you can do to make them more energy efficient. Now, our role here was to try and show how you can do it without ruining the architectural interest of these buildings. But principally, it came down to actually just changing the behavior of the individual and changing how they use those spaces. These are all things that can be learned and have wider outcomes than just preserving the architectural heritage. In terms of how we look after that heritage, we've also been thinking about how to do it differently. So currently we're reviewing the management plan for the World Heritage Site. And in doing that, we decided to borrow the place wheel used by the Scottish Government in order to measure the impact of various aspects on people's lives in the city and get their feedback. Through this, up to 1,000 people gave us extremely detailed feedback on what they were worried about in the city centre, and we could then relate that to the management of the World Heritage Site. This was pretty challenging, but you can group these into areas of economic, social, and environmental sustainability as well. So it helps us push towards a sustainable management of a city centre. This then expands. You can see how people have reacted in the centre, most of it focused around issues of control within their own environment, and then expand out further into what those issues are and explain the consultation in ways people can understand. So often consultations get lost in the ether. But all this is about us acting as the translators. Us experts in heritage spent a lot of time in the past talking about the colours and smells and tastes of places from an architectural or historical viewpoint, not instead listening to residents and translating their concerns into those that the system understands. That indicates, though, the system probably needs changing to take into account their concerns. And the final point in my brief romp through innovation and heritage takes us on to this building, which is the Tron Kirk. This is a 3D model produced as part of a EU program, EU-funded program. The EU has been brilliant for innovation. Had we done this by ourselves, or set of programs, we could not have done it. Instead, we've got 6 cities coming together, and through that, there's a pot of about €250,000 available to help us interpret and map our cities through time. That kind of work wouldn't happen if we only had our share of it, but because we've come together, we can drive a much larger project which looks more deeply through the layers of our city and help us interpret it and tell the stories of the heritage for its people and to its people as well. In telling those stories, which we want to do in the future in the Tron, we want to ask the residents to tell their stories, to tell us why the city is important, to tell the story of how they've saved the city in the last 30 or 40 years, rather than telling the dry histories of people, of great lords and their great battles over the years. It also takes us more deeply as a place into the integrated approach to heritage. How can we ensure that heritage isn't just something which you do on the side of running a city, but is actually at the very, very heart of it? How can we integrate that within the way the city is planned? I'm pleased to say that within the city there's a movement within the council to try and get heritage integrated into the way it's managed. And I think, finally, the point that the Tron Kirk makes, if we can get it running as a place for heritage to be interpreted, to get every school child to come through and learn about who they are, it makes the point more strongly that heritage isn't just about old buildings and National Trust properties, but it's really about who we are as a people. It's not about standing still. It's about change. It's about real lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was most interesting. Our next keynote speaker is Janet Egdell, who is Operations Director at Registers of Scotland. Janet has worked at Registers of Scotland for nearly 3 years as Operations Director and Accountable Officer. She started her working life as a rural economist and has worked in a range of roles across academia, the third sector, and government. Most recently, prior to joining Registers, she worked within Scottish Government on infrastructure investment. 2017 represents the 400th anniversary of the creation of the world's first National Land and Property Register. Janet will highlight the work undertaken by Registers of Scotland in digital transformation to future-proof Scotland's land and property data. Ladies and gentlemen, our second keynote speaker of the evening is Janet Egdell.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. This is a great opportunity for us because following on from what Adam's been talking around with heritage, it's being asked to speak here about what we do at Registers of Scotland around our land and property registers in particular, and how they kind of mirror the heritage, the social heritage changes over the years, and how that has displayed the innovations going on in the rest of society has been a really interesting, it has given a really interesting perspective to us thinking about what we should share with you this evening. So I'm glad to be here and to be able to do that. We're very conscious that lots of people have not heard of us. We are the organisation that looks, if you've bought or sold a house, and we look after your property rights. We keep the registers of those property rights. And yet lots of people wouldn't know that. You do it through a solicitor. You wouldn't necessarily come across us. So it's quite interesting to think through what we've been doing over the years and give you a bit of that historical perspective on it. Thinking back before official records began, there was the ancient ceremony of seizing, taken from the French word for meaning to seize, and that marked the official transfer of land ownership. So the ceremony involved the handing over of a clod of earth and stones to represent the transfer of land from one owner to another. If any of you have watched Outlander, they're often doing that on that. This image shows a seizing ceremony from the mid-20th century as the Dalyell family present a clod of earth for House of the Binns. The young man there in the kilt was the MP Tam Dalyell, who sadly passed away earlier this year. So one of the most famous examples of the seizing ceremony is remembered in a plaque on the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle. It commemorates the seizing ceremony when Scottish nobles gained possession of new provinces and baronies in faraway Nova Scotia during the reign of James VI and in the 17th century. Because of this, some now claim that the Edinburgh Castle esplanade is a part of Canada. This is the plaque that commemorates it. The idea of the seizing ceremony may seem archaic, but it survived into the 21st century. The last legal ceremony of seizing was performed in 2002, when Glenmorangie handed over the land of St Mary's Chapel in Easter Ross to the Cadboll Trust. So going back to the 13th century in Scotland, under the feudal system, no individual or organisation could hold land absolutely, other than by the authority of the king. When authority was granted, it was usually in the form of a charter, such as that granted to Holyrood Abbey by David I of Scotland, or the example shown here for King Robert I. This system not only set out rights to land, but also gave the owner rights to resources such as crops, livestock, fishing, and mineral rights. The King's administration kept a record of these charters in a parchment roll register, and Edinburgh Castle housed the very first inventory and register of land. Seizing ceremonies were still being used around 1491, when the first written records of ownership, not granted by the Crown, were created by the hand of Thomas Cow, priest of Diocese of Aberdeen. The stones and earth shown here, which we've got at display in our office at Meadowbank House, commemorate the longevity of this practice. The ceremony later lent its name to the first official land register, as mentioned by Sue, which was created in 1617, making it the oldest national land register in the world, which we're very proud of. The 1617 Registration Act of the Old Scots Parliament allowed individuals to have their ownership deeds recorded for the very first time. As you can see from this image, the General Register of Sazines was description-based, as maps were not yet widely used. And over the years, we've worked through the innovations as maps have been added to our records. The 17th century was also a time of new homes for Scotland, Scotland's registration information, rather, where we kept it. 1662 saw the start of the move of records from Edinburgh Castle to the basement of, or Lay Hall of the Parliament Hall in the High Street. Conditions were not ideal, with vermin and damp having a destructive impact on the records. Many of the documents were also lost due to the wide variety of locations in which they were stored out with Lay Hall, once space became limited. Within 100 years, the hall had become too small, and in 1765, the first purpose-built record repository of the world was commissioned, Register House, which we just saw on the map, there for the new town in the east end of Edinburgh's Princes Street. It incorporated innovative features specifically designed for the task at hand, such as isolated stone-built compartments to reduce fire risk and heating to reduce damp. However, the build of the repository was not all plain sailing. There was a grant of £12,000, was obtained in 1765, and work began in 1774. But by 1779, the building was still incomplete and roofless, and funds had run out. This led to the dome being described as the most expensive pigeon house in Europe. In 1779, Register House was even used as Edinburgh's first airport, as the unfinished rotunda was used for the assembly and launch of hot air balloons. Thankfully, maybe, unless you were into hot air balloons perhaps, new funds were gained from the sale of confiscated lands of Jacobite supporters after the defeat at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and the building was completed in 1787, 22 years after the original grant. So here is the famous building with the statue of Wellington in front. This iconic building solved the storage problems, but Scotland's records were in a sorry state. Thomas Thompson, the first deputy clerk, whose portrait is held in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, was a champion of their restoration. He oversaw a 9-year period of restoration and indexing of over 6,500 crumbling volumes. By the mid-19th century, industrialisation had led to a massive drift of the population from the countryside to industrial towns, such as Dundee. The considerable change in land use and subsequent increase in demand for housing meant the system of property registration had to be overhauled. Recognising this, there was the Land Register of Scotland Act 1868, introduced to reform. It introduced important reforms to the Sazine and other registers. The Act provided that in future, all information relating to lands and heritages in Scotland should be recorded in presentment books, sorted by county and held centrally in Edinburgh. Explains why some of our records still are in the old counties, which pre-local authority reforms back in the 90s. As early as the 1860s, Registers of Scotland was investigating the use of new technologies. This included an experimental technique to reproduce documents using a camera. Was, however, prohibitively expensive at the time, so was not introduced until 1934. In 1871, search sheets, a chronological history of all transactions for a property, were introduced to reduce the time and cost of searching and producing the registers. This initiative was controversial, and debate continued internally for 20 years, with various options for the search sheets under consideration and trial. I remember that when we're having some debates at the moment about, whether we should move from paper to digital systems. Actually, we've 20 years to introduce a search sheet is where we've come from. The final version was produced in 1905 and is used in much the same form today. Search sheets were handwritten up until the use of the typewriting machine, and that was authorised for use from the Secretary of State for Scotland in 1921. Again, I think it was quite controversial, so it had to be authorised. These improvements helped to prepare Registers of Scotland for the changes in the volume of work that were to come throughout the 20th century, as economic conditions affected the number of property and land transactions. Even before World War II had ended, plans were being made to develop Scotland's towns and countryside. Many people believe that a lot of the land in Scotland was underused, especially in upland areas. These were seen as ideal places to create a productive forestry industry, and the Forestry Commission is still Scotland's largest landowner, with more than 7% of the land mass. Accurate maps were produced for the first time, which crucially could also be used to identify land ownership more precisely. And in 1948, as a result of these changes, the government split the office into two bodies. The General Register Office for Scotland became responsible for the births, marriages and deaths, and Registers of Scotland, where I work, became responsible for Scotland's land and property records. In the second half of the 20th century, home ownership in Scotland rose dramatically. This was due, of course, to the economic growth that was going on and the policies of UK governments at the time, with initiatives such as the right to buy your local authority-owned home. This meant that larger numbers of home ownership titles had to be registered, especially in towns and cities. In turn, this put great pressure on Registers of Scotland. The increase in the volume of registered titles meant that Register House, that first purpose-built record repository in the world, was no longer big enough. And Registers of Scotland moved to its new home in 1976 at Meadowbank House. Not quite as attractive, perhaps, from the outside as where we moved from. And the National Records of Scotland, as now is, has stayed in Register House. The introduction of the Land Registration Scotland Act 1979 created a map-based register of title that simplified the land registration process and later would progressively replace the General Register of Saysine. Here we can see an example of a map-based register with the property being Edinburgh Castle there. This, of course, gave people much more security about what they were actually owning. The new register established the boundary of any piece of land through survey and issued the proprietor with a certificate of title guaranteed by the state. And that's what we still do. We guarantee people their property rights. That simplified the process and the amount of time and resource required to register a property. We still are on a journey of trying to make that more and more efficient, but it's been moving on. 1981 also marked a major milestone as Ros acquired its first computer to support the newly launched land register. It was, I'm told, roughly the size of a barn and took up an entire wing of that building on the second floor. And the end wall had to be removed to actually get it in. So I suspect that it had about the size of memory that you've probably got in your phone in your pocket. You know, anyway, times have moved on. 1981. Between 1993 and 1997, the General Register of Saysine was digitised, allowing for computerised searches of the registers, saving vast amounts of office space. In the last year of the millennium, there was progressive development of the electronic systems relating to registering property transactions. So that takes us forward to a slightly more digital age. The development and introduction of Registers Direct provided a tool where we could allow online access to the land registers and the information held within them, and that you need as essential to buying a property. So that saved people actually coming in and looking at all our records. In 2007, we had a second version of Registers Direct, and at the same time we were launching our first e-registration product, which was the automated registration of the title of land. That allowed customers to actually put title deeds on, register them online. So that's a journey which is speeding up with us at the moment. Further changes to legislation were brought about in 2012, which were very significant from our perspective, introducing the Land Registration Scotland Act that allowed for the use of e-registration, allows for e-signatures and and has led to the phasing out of that 400-year-old register of Sazine. Nowadays, digital is changing everything, from how we work, how we consume services, and that pace of change, that pace of innovation feels like it's really speeding up all the time. And so that technology is influencing Registers of Scotland and how we hold our information, how we share that information with others. It's also helping our carbon impact because we have moved away from a lot of paper to holding things online. So we're in the midst of a digital transformation, which is moving us from that historical-based paper organisation to one that is trying to do everything digitally. By 2020, we're expecting to be a fully digital organisation. And so we're doing a lot of work with our main customers to work with them the best ways of delivering that. We're keen to make our services greener, faster, more efficient than they've ever been before. And with these ambitions, we're moving along and having some successes so far. Just want to share a few of those with you. One example is this digital discharge service, which we've introduced over the last few months. I'm sure many of you will have had a mortgage. Some of you may have been lucky enough to get to the end of that mortgage and pay it off. And there was a long, convoluted process whereby you go through a solicitor and they talk to your lender, and the lender then talks back to the solicitor, and then eventually it gets sent to us, and a whole paper trail of this going on for usually several months, and we would be able to then take that security off the title that you own to the property. We can now do that in minutes with this new service, and we can do it more securely from the lender's point of view. It gives them a lot more security. So much more efficient, much more the way we want to be doing services in the future. Looking ahead, we're expecting more of that kind of innovation. One thing that's we're doing a lot of work on is following Scottish ministers asked us to complete the land register back in a couple of years ago and complete it by 2024. So we have those lovely old deeds in Sazine, which give lots of historic information, but aren't very good at telling you exactly where your boundaries are. And we're moving people onto the land register, which is much more map-based and more easy to access and use the information. And what we want to do is move everything across from Sazines to the land register by 2024. This map just shows you the red areas of what's already on the land register. So we've got about 62% at the moment of titles, but only just about 30% of the land. Some of the large estates and so on, as they come on to the land register, we expect to see that increasing considerably. I said about Forestry Commission earlier, didn't I? As we're expecting all their land to be registered with us, for example, over the next year or so. So what we're hoping that will do is we see a completed land register as actually a really useful asset for Scotland, and it can contribute to just making it easier to do business in Scotland. It helps in our overall objective of supporting a wealthier and fairer society. The completion of the land register also goes hand in hand with another of our exciting developments, ScotLIS. What we're doing with ScotLIS is we not only want to hold the registers and the information on the registers, but actually what we are wanting to do is share that information and make it much more accessible than it has been in the past. So ScotLIS is an online land and information system that ultimately will allow citizens, communities, professionals and business users to find out comprehensive information about any piece of land or property in Scotland with a single inquiry. We're designing it with the user at heart, continuously redesigning it as we get feedback from the users that we're trialling it out with, and we'll keep evolving it as information needs and information wants change over time. We're also on track to, as I say, become fully digital by 2020. So we're continuing to try and innovate and think of new ways of doing business. So in terms of innovation, we have our own, what we call an innovation centre, that we've developed to try new ways of doing things and just be open to new processes. And we're particularly keen on working with our users and actually using that feedback. We found some of our early forays into the digital world. I talked about that ARTL system, our first e-registration system. Actually, the uptake wasn't that great, so we've learned a lot of lessons from that, and we're trying to do it in a very customer-focused ways these days. So just to conclude, the 400-year history of the Registers of Scotland is one that follows the social and economic landscape of Scotland. The theme of innovation and adaptation is woven throughout our story, from the world's first national land register via Edinburgh's first airport to the creation of a modern and robust land and property system fit for a digital age. Thank you.
Jack, would you like to take a seat? And Adam, could you join us? Thank you. Well, big thank you to both our speakers. That was most interesting. I learned a lot, so I appreciate it. Thank you. I know I've got lots of questions, but more importantly, we'd like to take some questions from the audience. We've got 2 wireless mics, one on either side. So if you can, please wait for the mic to arrive before asking your question. But the floor is yours. We'd be pleased to hear from anybody. Any questions for either Adam or Janet?
Thank you. A couple of quick questions to Adam, please. The first one is really the obvious one, but is the EU funding, such as you're getting for the Tron, now under threat from Brexit?
EU funding, is generally under threat. We've been building up our experience within the European programmes to access it. However, we're not out of it. There are a number of programmes which take in surrounding nations in Europe. And one of those which we're in for a very large project at the moment, we'll hear about next month, is a part of that. So Interreg, there's various different programmes, allow those neighbouring nations to become involved, whether it'll be the UK or whether it's Israel. So there's a range of different ways we can still access some elements of that funding. But it's the bringing together of people which we'll lose, and that sharing of problems across Europe and being able to find common solutions together and bringing more of that experience, which we'll lose. So we're trying to find other ways of doing that. And we've always had, we've worked hard at getting good links with Latin American cities as well through the big institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank, who when they make a loan to a city for a new sewerage system want to make sure they don't destroy the community. And so they look to other parts of the world for examples in how they can do that. So they might come and talk to us about those sorts of things. So there's still opportunities.
The other question was, I noticed that there was on one of the diagrams you had a microgeneration on the roof of one of the buildings.
Yes, that's right.
And
yeah.
I wondered, given that Edinburgh's got so many flats and therefore less opportunity for solar energy, whether you were doing any work with the Edinburgh Solar Cooperative?
The example which you showed there was an early experiment with the Lister Housing Cooperative. So you had the whole block in one ownership in those different flats, and that was using solar thermal. We've worked on trials with different tenement blocks, and the first thing you have to do is get agreement, which is what we're doing if we're going to do a repair project anyway. And once you've got agreement, then you can then start to talk about what sort of things might be done. And have that discussion with the planners as well. So it's quite a challenge, and in those cases the microgeneration goes in the valley gutter where only the seagulls can see it. But it's still pretty rare within the city centre, as it is. It's risky and it's challenging. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question about the land register operation. Having seen some very old house deeds in Queensferry, they're long and complicated, Is there any danger in the digitisation process that we'll lose some history and heritage by what goes onto the computer and what's missed?
We're certainly aiming not to lose that, but actually to make it more available. So we're not moving away from a deeds-based system, and so that history of the deeds should all be there. I guess there is a question that we are interested in how much people use them. I think they have a historic interest. Though we do find that when solicitors are doing the transaction, they quite often are interested in the latest, of course, the last, and so there's probably a different purpose for keeping the history, but we need that record there, and so we're not aiming to lose anything. It's hard to do things 100%. Absolutely correctly. We do find with some of the older handwritten things, it's very difficult to do optical reading of them and so on, and get it as accurate as possible. But we're aiming not to lose that heritage.
Benjamin's hand went up first.
Thank you. Thinking about innovation and how to bring both your stories together, there's a reputation that records have of being slightly dry and boring. And what I think could be added to the information that you have online is the stories about the people that Adam was talking about. Is there any possibility that in the next 20 years or so you could overlay your maps and plans of the stories about people who lived in these places?
Interesting idea.
Yeah. I mean, from our point of view, it's something which is very doable. The gathering of stories and memories is something which is easily done and converted into a digital file. A lot of work happens on OpenStreetMaps through the MESH project, which I'm sure you're aware with, which has been run by colleagues at Edinburgh University, mapping Edinburgh's social history. And they've done brilliant work bringing records together onto OpenStreetMaps. You can click on one place and find out a huge amount of detail. Opportunities there. Yeah,
it's a very interesting thought, because I said about we're moving forward with this ScotList, the Land and Information System, and we've really focused on our kind of first initial use of it, which would be to make what we've got more readily accessible. I think where do we go next with that is a really interesting idea, and we certainly see ourselves as wanting to make our data more matchable with other data, whether we just point to other people's data or have one platform that holds it all. So there's lots of things we're doing at the moment about just making our references link in with all the local authority data and so on, so that it would be easier to make those stories work. And there's obviously work we could do with national records around the births, marriages and deaths and so on. So I think there's a lot of scope in this big data age that we're in, that to actually do more in that space.
I think what you're also pointing to there is one of the big challenges which Scotland has as a small nation is that we have all the institutions of a big nation, and that could actually be a real barrier to innovation in the future, because everyone has their little empire, their own kingdom, and we don't all necessarily talk to each other. That's what happens when you have institutions. They often become introspective, and for someone feeling radical, there might be opportunity to reduce the number of institutions we have dealing with these different aspects and bring some of them together. It happened in Sweden with the bringing together of libraries, heritage, and I think museums all under one roof, which was a really bold thing to have done. But they recognised that they weren't a huge nation, and actually these things could be dealt with and more boundaries crossed by bringing groups together.
This gentleman wanted to...
This is a question for Adam. I keep seeing the occasional headlines saying that Edinburgh's UNESCO World Heritage Site is under threat, or the certification is under threat. Is there funding coming from the Scottish Government or City Council, or who is helping to maintain your certification that we have at the moment?
Well, Scottish Government, in the form of the Scottish Office, and the City of Edinburgh Council are the ones who ask for World Heritage status. So they're the ones who provide funding to help keep it at the state of conservation as it is and through our grants programs. Most of it comes from Scottish Government. A small proportion comes from the council, as it has so little money nowadays. Otherwise, we rely on donations from the public to help keep things going. So about 50% of our revenue as an organisation comes from the public. The rest comes from other sources, such as Scottish Government. World Heritage Site status, it's a result of an international convention. It's a treaty. And so there are obligations upon UK government and therefore Scottish Government to meet that treaty, as with any treaty. And that's about how we look after the authenticity of our World Heritage Site. Now, World Heritage was set up at a point when you had a series of objects to look after, like a museum piece, which has no practical life. But it got more complicated when we started moving into cities. And we're very much a living city. It's a very complex thing, therefore, to manage what makes Edinburgh special without freezing it in time. And that's where the discussion of threats come up. And we're very keen to ensure that the management of the city is done so that we don't stifle change, but keep what's right. And we've seen some really big proposals for change come through recently. And the one which has got those who work within the system of architectural and historical values most upset is about the Royal High School and what's going on there with proposals for very large hotel extensions when there's a viable, fully funded alternative which doesn't do that. And so that leads this question of threat. But to actually lose World Heritage status is going to take quite a lot of effort. That would have to happen first. And you've got to let the local systems of protection work before you send in the international committee to come and investigate. And we don't want to get that far down the road. Now, I've actually got faith that the City of Edinburgh Council will reject the hotel proposals because it goes against every single policy in their book. Whether the Scottish Government then takes that further or not is another question which we don't know the answer to. But it would be very odd for Scottish Government at this point in time to be turning its back on international treaty obligations.
Tracy, yes.
Sorry, just referring back to the question before regarding memories and so on. You might contact the people at the libraries because they have something called SCRAN, which SCRAN, which is something like Scottish Central Resource Archive. It's not that, but it's something like network. And they've been taking, recording stories and so on. And I would have thought they'd have a lot of stuff that you could use. Plus, they've got a very big website as well. Mm-hmm. You know, so that's the right hand not knowing what the left hand's doing, funded by the council.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I think there's almost too many opportunities. What direction do we go, and which are the sensible ones for us to link in with, and others to, and so on. So yeah, it's good. It's a good suggestion. Mm. Mm.
And can you please tell me why is it so difficult for the government, or not the government, to say for you and others to persuade the City of Edinburgh Council that cultural tourism is important to our lifeblood, and that's what makes us stand out from other cities, or many other cities. Princes Street is an example, or the left-hand side. It's just awful. George Street is acceptable, but I mean, I know you can't do it all by yourself, but I just do not see why they can be so blind to the fact that tourists want to see something different. They don't just want to go to a city and see the same chain, the same everything. Mm-hmm. They want to see something else.
There are tremendous challenges around tourism. It's one of the key earners for this city and provides jobs. And yet that tourism is being driven by a lot of the airlines who come here. Are basically EasyJet and Ryanair dominate the airport. So they're not bringing tourists who are going to spend an enormous amount of money in the city. And that starts to impact and shape what else happens around the city in terms of hotel supply and other such things. So it's an enormously complicated topic. And we're about to put in a bid for funds from the EU to work with our partner cities such as Malaga around how you can understand and get the most out of tourism. So actually Airbnb is an enormous challenge in the city right now because it creates absentee landlords and then problems around maintenance. The visitors use the city differently to those who live in those residential blocks. And there's a lot to understand about how you can handle that. We don't know how to deal with that yet. And there's a lot of learning to be done before trying to work with colleagues in the city to get the right policies in place.
Interesting. This gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. I've been fascinated by the question that a few people have asked about how ordinary people have been involved in finding out about properties that they live in and being then involved in the restoration, and also indeed the opportunities of digitization can offer in terms of some of the historic records. My question really was just from Janet, what was the charging policy behind some of this? Because in a sense, we've all paid for this, it's a necessary requirement. How do we achieve the maximum public good? I know there's been discussion, for example, around the access to mapping information and making that as widely and as cheaply available to all as possible. But also to Adam, whether this information resource is actually an opportunity for greater innovation, particularly when you think about things like citizen science and the opportunities perhaps to create new things which others have suggested government could do or bodies could do, but actually maybe there's the opportunity for entrepreneurial social activity as well.
Right, well, yes, as Registers of Scotland, we're a trading fund, so we are fully funded from the fees that we charge for our services. So you will, if you've bought or sold a house, you'll have had your solicitor's fees, plus there'll have been a bit for registering your house with us. So most of our fees are £60, and with that you get the state guarantee. Always controversial what we should be funding. There is lots of debate in the, as calling ourselves an information organisation going forward. Lots of people would like to see open data, and lots of people would like to see open and free data. And there is, for us, that's a real challenge, because we think to maintain good quality data, actually some charging for it is often the best way of making that sustainable over the long term. And keeping up the quality of the data as we go, and keeping up the currency of the data. So we are doing our very best when we are talking about making ourselves more efficient. Actually, some of that allows us to just keep our fees at a fairly low level that hasn't changed much over many a year. Really interesting as we go forward. We think that we have probably made our information relatively accessible to the solicitors who we deal with all the time. We've not made it very easily accessible to just general citizens, and we're trying to work through, well, actually, what kind of information are people interested in that? We actually are the source of all that house price data you get on Rightmove and Zoopla. They buy it from us and use it on their websites. Should we be providing that directly? What level of that should we be providing for free? And will that just be of interest to people, and that might tempt them to come and buy another service from us? And so, what's the level of what we should charge for and what we shouldn't? So, we mapping, we have a particular agreement with Ordnance Survey. We use them, they are our base map that we use, and then we register the properties on that. So they have some rights over that and some charging, so we're linked in with their charging policies. Across the public sector, we've got an agreement with Ordnance Survey, so that we've got a relatively good deal that we share across local authorities and Scottish Government and ourselves and so on. Very interesting, 2024, I just said we would have completed the land register. So then we don't need the base map anymore, potentially. We've actually got a different map. So, you could see all of that changing, or actually Ordnance Survey are changing their policies anyway, and they provide a lot of information for free as well these days, as well as then tempting people in to use their services. So, it's a good debate to be had, and we certainly, I could see us providing more information going forward, and online there will be some information, I'm sure, on ScotList that we hope people will find of interest for free. But I think to sustain ourselves as a business, I mentioned in my title as accountable officer, so I'm accountable for us being a going business. So actually we need to make sure that we don't give away the crown jewels so that we can't look after them next year. But we do give people access to good information that we hold.
I think there's a tremendous challenge and tension around that as well, because innovation requires failure, and big institutions aren't allowed to do things that fail. And so putting information out there to the public to do citizen science projects and try different things with is how you're going to get the maximum innovation out of all that data that's out there in this big new world brave world of big data. But institutions are naturally going to be averse to that because they've got a core mission to complete. And I don't know how you square that circle. It's a really, really challenging one.
Can I just add something on that? Just thinking, I mean, maybe there is something that we just need to face up to. That it's a bit like expecting people to get their media sources and do a bit of, well, do I believe that or don't I? You know, actually, and there's something around that with data as well. That there's we worry, I think, a lot about the quality of the data. But actually, maybe we should just face up to the fact that people will make a good judgment about that looks like good quality data for this purpose, but it's not good enough for doing that with it. You know, I'm not going to buy and sell a house on that, but I'll do this with it. So perhaps we probably ourselves need to just get better at being very clear about levels of accuracy, levels of, you know, what you might want to use this for, and that might help us to be more open as well with some of our data.
The gentleman up at the top, I know, has been trying to say something, ask something.
It's time, I think, for the fantasy football question, which is, if money was no object, which project would either one of you, both of you, really, really like to see realised in your particular field?
Great question.
I could give you a physical project that would obviously happen, which for us would be the Tron Kirk. It's quite straightforward. It's a £10 million project. Anyone who wins the lottery, come and talk to me to bring together interpretation and conservation. I think in terms of wider projects, the one which I'm most interested in is getting Edinburgh out there wider, getting our experience out to places that really need that support and help, whether it's our colleagues in areas close to or affected by war, or areas where there isn't the money to do traditional conservation, and help try and change minds and move conservation to more of a values base in those places, using Edinburgh's expertise and experience and failures and mistakes to help their learning as well.
Janet, anything to add to that?
I think mine's somewhat parochial after that when I'm to think about it, but we hold 18 registers at the moment, and there are lots of places across the public sector who are also registering things, lots of organisations. I would like us to vastly expand that. We could be working better in partnership with others to actually help them with registers. We've got a lot of expertise in our organisation, and we don't, and we could. I would like us to be able to invest more in sharing that further with others.
Well, I think that's a great note for us to end on. A great set of questions, great speakers. Your presentation is most useful too. We seem to have touched on a lot of the hot potatoes of the day, community involvement and the social aspects of innovation heritage I found particularly interesting. We talked about sustainability, big data, cultural tourism, how the digital world impacts on it, lots of the interesting topics of the day. So thank you very much for everybody's contributions. If you want to hear more on this theme of innovation in heritage, this year's Tourism Societies Symposium is on that same topic, and will be held in Edinburgh on the 5th and 6th of June. So for more details on that conference, please visit the Tourism Society's website. The next in the Innovation Nation series of lectures is here at the EICC on the 25th of May and is about innovation bridges, obviously tied in with the opening of the new bridge. So please check the EICC website for further details on that. So big thanks to everybody for coming tonight. There's now refreshments waiting for us outside in the foyer. So many thanks and good night.